Hello and welcome to the Asbestos and Hazardous Materials Consultants Association Lead Webinar. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respect to elders, past, present and emerging. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is John Batty. I'm the Secretary of the AHCA. Typically, we like to have these sessions in an open forum where everyone can ask questions, we can share a beer and talk about some of the experiences we have had. Obviously, with the situations around COVID, we're unable to do this, so we have decided to run a webinar so everyone can partake.
Have we got speakers?
We ask that everyone leaves their mic on mute during the session. There's
select
nothing
a
worse than
speaker.
people talking in the background while others want to listen to their presenters.
Huh?
Should you have any questions during the session, we ask that you type your questions through on the group chat. We have Jason North and Lee Brown available to review all the questions and then vocalise them to our speakers.
I thought we could hear things.
A portion of time at the end of each speaker's presentation for everyone to ask some questions.
You know, when you're doing induction.
First of all, I'd like to go through some news, some situations that the AHCA has been working on in the past 4 months while we've been having COVID. Firstly, we've created a working group around asbestos in soil. The Asbestos in Soils working group was formed in February, consultants, contractors and the Asbestos Eradication Agency. The group has been tackling a number of issues from that date, and some of these including working group around the WA guidelines for the assessment, remediation and management of asbestos contaminated sites. That was finalised. We reviewed that and provided comment in March 2020. We're also working or discussing issues around the use of non-destructive digging in asbestos impacted soil. As part of this, a questionnaire will be forwarded through to all our members as a fact-finding mission. Obviously, there is a concern around the use of high-pressure water and vacuum extraction, and we want to understand what our members have been facing and I guess some comments we can receive from them. Recently, the Asbestos Safety and Eradication Agency drafted an asbestos, cement, water and sewer pipe management guideline. This is currently being reviewed by the working group for comment, and this will be distributed to our members as well. And then finally, SafeWork New South Wales is in the process of updating the New South Wales Asbestos in or on soil guideline. The AHCA and the working group will be part of the review and comment process. This will also be shared with our members. So I'd like to announce that at the moment, or as of a couple of months ago, we have developed a memorandum of understanding between the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists and the Asbestos and Hazardous Materials Consultants Association to work together in appropriate ways to establish and develop our future relationship. So working together, the AOH and the AHCA intend to use responsible endeavours to promote the following areas of collaboration. So these include exchange of scientific information and publication, subscription to the representative institutes' newsletters and official journals, including cross-referencing and sharing of news articles and other online information, promoting the benefits of working in partnerships, promoting the professional development activities of each other's organisations to their members, and encourage the networking of AOH and AHCA members. The AOH and AHCA will liaise and to discuss how potential synergies can be developed for the benefit of both organisations. And then finally, we're going to identify situations where we can come together for training courses, seminars and conferences. And this is what we're doing here today. So Andrew's offered his time to come and speak to our members around this issue. So we're fast approaching the AHCA's first anniversary. The 16th of July marks the official launch of the AHCA and our first event with guest speaker Jason Wall from SafeWork New South Wales discussing asbestos in soil. Since that day, the membership of the AHCA has grown considerably with over 50 individual members and over 20 business members. As a thank you to our current members, the AHCA Executive Committee has decided to offer a free 12-month membership to our existing members. A renewal form will be sent through to all existing members that requires completion and return for your 2021 membership to be finalised. To all those who don't currently have a membership, I can't encourage you more to be part of the AHCA. It will give you an opportunity to attend AHCA events, be part of working groups, attend roundtable sessions and collaborate with your peers in the industry. So go become members. At the bottom of the slide, you can see the membership link, ahca.org.au/memberships. So as the operation has come to 12 months, it is time for our AGM. Communication will be forwarded through to all members in the coming months. The annual general meeting will include the election of the executive committee members. All the AHC members are welcome to nominate themselves or nominate a colleague to be part of the executive committee. And we encourage anyone who's passionate and wanting to make a change in the industry to nominate themselves or nominate their colleagues to be part of the AHCA. So watch this space. A lead working group. Obviously, we've decided to have this session because lead is a major issue that a lot of us are facing as consultants in the industry and the greater industry as well. The AHCA is more than just asbestos. We are the Asbestos and Hazardous Materials Consultants Association. And as such, it is our responsibility to tackle the hazardous materials issues facing our members and the industry. As such, the AHCA will be launching a lead working group. We encourage our members to be part of that group. A communication with the terms of reference of the lead working group will be sent out to our members requesting expressions of interest. It is the intention of the AHCA that the working group will also have representatives from the regulator or the regulators, as well as industry groups. And hopefully together, we could tackle some of the issues that we are all facing around tipping, around removal of lead paint, around concentrations of lead in dust. I know these are all issues we are facing, and as a working group, we can work together to hopefully find a solution and a consistent solution. So this webinar is the first in a series of events around lead, specifically around lead paint and dust. So obviously today's session is around exposure risk associated with lead. And we're lucky enough to have two amazing speakers who have got a wealth of knowledge around lead and lead exposure. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Andrew Orfanos. For the last 9 years, Andrew has held the role of the National Occupational Health and Hygiene Specialist for Caltex Petroleum Australia Proprietary Limited. Previously to this time, Andrew spent 2 years in the role of Corporate Occupational Health and Hygiene Manager at BHP Billiton and 5 years at Zinifex as Senior Occupational Hygienist at the Port Pirie Lead Smelter. Andrew spent his formative hygiene years as a collaborative research centre in occupational health and safety, University of Adelaide in a number of roles including laboratory analyst, tutor, occupational hygienist and technical advice coordinator providing consultancy services to South Australia, State Emergency Service and government agencies. Andrew has now left Caltex and has moved into the private consulting, having set up advanced occupational health and hygiene solutions. Andrew is a certified occupational hygienist and the president of the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists. Andrew has over 20 years experience that covers a wide range of industries, including the mining, manufacturing and retail industries in Australia and worldwide. Andrew's area of expertise and passion covers a diverse range of workplace hazards, including asbestos, hazardous chemicals, respirable crystalline silica management, all the way to developing and managing comprehensive drug and alcohol programs. Andrew has been kind enough to offer his time to present to the AHCA today, and he will be speaking about the health effects, exposure pathways, and addressing exposure associated with lead. I'd like to welcome Andrew to the stage.
Thank you, John, and thank you, AHCA, for having me here today to be able to talk about something that I'm very passionate about and have spent quite a lot of my professional career dealing with or managing workplace lead exposures. As John also said, there's an opportunity to ask questions, so please put them in the chat room, and at the end of my presentation we'll be able to go through some of them. As John said, I'll be talking about, I'll give you an overview of the health effects of lead. I'll also then go into detail around the exposure pathways and then also ways of assessing exposure. So just to give you an overview of the health effects, you can break down the health effects into sort of short-term subacute health effects. So we're looking at certain blood lead ranges. It's a good way to classify them. So if you've got a blood lead of between 60 to 120 micrograms per deciliter, you're looking at health effects such as anemia, fatigue, headaches, irritability, forgetfulness, lethargy, impaired concentration, depression, and mood changes. At the other extreme, if you're exposed to significantly high levels of lead short term, and in this case, it's probably you'd be exposed to lead fume at very high levels, and you're looking at around the 460 micrograms per deciliter. You're talking about things like acute lead encephalopathy, which is basically reversible brain damage. I always used to tell the contractors at the Port Pirie lead smelter when they first used to come, and they couldn't understand why the pigeons were walking around looking like they were drunk. It was because they were drinking out of contaminated water puddles and they actually had acute lead encephalopathy. Long-term exposures can cause much more serious health outcomes. So if someone's consistently exposed to, or consistently have a blood level greater than 40 micrograms per deciliter, you'll have elevated blood pressure, which obviously has a lot of adverse health outcomes that are associated with having elevated blood pressure. Can impact on male fertility. If you have lead consistently greater than 50 micrograms per deciliter, you're starting to look at deficits in visual, sensory and cognitive functions, such as memory and learning abilities. And if you're consistently have a blood lead level of around 60 micrograms per deciliter, you're looking at clinical neuropathy, which is nerve damage, and nephropathy, which is kidney damage. Continued long-term exposure can also enhance noise-induced hearing loss. So obviously you may be aware that lead is an ototoxic agent. It can also speed up the age-related changes in your brain function, and also increases the likelihood of developing cardiovascular disease, such as atherosclerosis. And lead has been shown to decrease the activity of PON1, which is a very important antioxidant enzyme which stops fatty plaques building up on the walls of our arteries. I just want to talk about health effects associated with children. Preschool age children and fetuses are the most vulnerable when it comes to the effects of lead exposure. There's been many studies in this space, and there's a clear relationship between being exposed to lead and impaired mental state, so reduced IQ in children, and also in impairments of physical development, so stunting of growth. And these studies have shown that there's really no threshold level for these effects. So there's no magical level below a certain level of exposure of lead where you're okay. Exposure obviously can begin way before birth, when the mother can be exposed to lead, and that lead is transferred by the umbilical cord into the circulatory system of the unborn baby. And as such, there's a significant risk from exposure to lead way before even a pregnancy becomes known. And that's why there's so many sort of risk management controls around women of reproductive age working in potential lead exposure risk areas. So why are preschool kids and fetuses at high risk? Well, there's a few reasons why. First, they're far more susceptible to the effects of lead because in a in a fetus, the blood-brain barrier isn't fully formed, and so more lead can actually get into the central nervous system and up into the brain and have an adverse effect. Also, a little kid or a little baby, you don't need much lead to actually elevate their blood lead levels. So that's another confounding problem. As you know, with toddlers and crawlers, everything goes into their mouth. So that hand mouth action really is a significant pathway for toddlers. And why that's even more important is that they actually absorb up to 50% of all lead that they actually ingest because of their undeveloped digestive system, whereas in adults it's only about 10 to 15%. And the other thing is, obviously, a baby's growing, their bones are constantly growing and remodeling, and only 70% of lead is actually stored in the bone compared to an adult. So there's actually more there's more lead flowing around the blood to actually have an impact on target organs such as the brain and the central nervous system. Just wanted to touch briefly on the pharmacokinetics of lead. So obviously people are familiar that obviously lead can enter the body through inhalation and ingestion, and it can also be absorbed through the skin, but that's not the case with most inorganic compounds and probably what you'd be seeing in the workplaces. But it is important that certain forms of lead can be absorbed through the skin. 5% of that lead that goes into the body goes into the circulatory system of the body, where it has a half-life of about a month. However, 95% of the lead that enters your body is actually absorbed into the bone. So your body can't tell the difference between calcium and lead. So if there's lead floating around, it brings it up and takes it into the bone. And there's actually the half-life associated with lead in the bone actually is variable. In the trabecular bone, that's your cartilage, it's a half-life of between 4 to 7 years. And in the cortical bone, the half-life of greater than 10 years. So over a long period of time, you can get a lot of lead being absorbed and taken up by your bones. And there's even been anecdotal studies where people that have been exposed to lead over a long period of time have actually broken a bone, and they've had acute lead poisoning from that lead coming out of the broken bone, which is interesting. And lead is primarily excreted in the urine. Now I just want to talk about the exposure sources to children, and most of these are pretty obviously lead-based paint. Toddlers, babies that are teething, they love to get their chompers into everything. You can imagine the old bassinets, baskets, windowsills used to be lead paint, so that was a great way for them to get into the lead. Also contaminated soil. Obviously babies have what they call picker tendency, where once again they love to put everything that tasted in their mouth. Dirts and that, so if you've got contaminated dirt and dust around the house or outside, that's a great way for it to get into a child. That's sort of, so there with lead containing dust. So lead containing dust, it could be there from renovations of houses or due to local industry, which is nearby. Could be also in rainwater. So a lot of old rainwater tanks could have lead piping. So obviously the lead could slowly leach into the rainwater, and it could go in that way if they drink the rainwater. Take-home lead, so that's obviously if family members work in a lead risk area and they bring contaminated clothing and themselves home, there's a risk of the child getting it that way. And Asbestos here is also leaded petrol. Obviously, before we banned leaded petrol, that was a significant source of lead exposure. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't actually appreciate, is that back in the day when we grew up, our average blood lead levels were around 30 micrograms per decilitre. And we're now talking about, health effects that we're seeing in children at, around the 5 microgram to decilitre point. So that's an interesting thing to take into account. Exposure sources for adults. Obviously, I've just touched base. Home renovating is obviously a great way for adults to be exposed to lead, obviously in lead paint, piping, flashing, that kind of thing. Hobbies. When I was at the refinery, we had a couple of individuals where we were really struggling to find out how they were being exposed to lead, and it wasn't until we actually visited their home, and actually asked them further questions. We understand some of them were making their own lead sinkers for their fishing. And one other person actually used to have the hobby of lead light windows. So they were being exposed to lead in that fashion. Obviously, a significant way of being exposed to lead for adults is obviously workplace exposures. And depending on the industry, that could be through fume, which is generated from molten metal, or it could be particulate dust, which is mechanically generated from material containing lead. And also some other people in a household can also be get this source of lead from take-home lead from other people working in lead risk industries. Just want to talk now about exposure sources for communities. One of the major sources of exposure for communities, obviously, if they've got local industry where there's lead risk works being done, those exposures come in a number of ways. First, obviously, it could be exhaust stacks emissions, so it's coming out of the stack and just blowing downwind onto communities. You could have contaminated equipment, which may be used on site that's taken onto contractor premises, and it can spread out into the community that way. Same with contaminated work vehicles that are used on site in these high lead risk industries and then travel in and out in the community. And also one example we had was at the lead refinery where we had an external contractor that was coming on site to repair tyres on the vehicles. And then what they were actually doing was taking the contaminated tyre off-site and just stacking them in the yard of their establishment. And there was kids just playing around, jumping on the tyres, and it was a great exposure source to the community. Historically, people also historical exposures, communities, obviously from building materials, use of lead contaminated soil and materials for road base and for landscaping. And as I mentioned before, leaded petrol is a significant source of contamination in the community, historical contamination. Okay, so I've talked about sort of the exposure pathways for groups of people, children, adults. But if we want to narrow down now and talk about workplace exposures and what are the factors that actually you need to take into account when you're looking at exposures. When I first started the refinery, the focus was obviously on inhalational exposure to lead. And they had once we had optimized the controls around managing exposure to breathing in lead dust and fume, we were still getting high lead levels. And it wasn't until I broke down and understood the toxicology and pharmacology of lead and looked at all the different other factors that you need to consider to determine how lead can actually get into the body. And one significant route of exposure that really isn't thought of that often is that of ingestion. And that's simply from contamination on hands and materials and then going into the mouth and then going into the body. So although it's not the primary route of exposure, if those other route exposures aren't there, this becomes significant. And when you talk about, ingestion, obviously that's going to be determined by the rate of entry into the body, obviously how long you're being exposed to the lead. Then when you look at ingestion, you've got to look at the bioavailability of the lead, and there's a number of factors will also impact that. So the pH, obviously stomach pH, the particle size, your diet as well will also impact on how well any lead is absorbed when you ingest it. Personal hygiene, obviously how clean the person is, do they bite their nails, do they smoke? All these things also impact on what goes into the mouth and potentially into the stomach and into the body. So this spread or this chart here shows a lot of different factors that once you map it all out, you can see that there's lots of things that you can actually look at and then identify particular control strategies for all of them to actually come up with a comprehensive exposure management plan. So I just want to go through just to highlight some obvious sort of workplace controls. Obviously, you've got the hierarchy of controls. You've got engineering controls where you're, using extraction and filtering to get out, the airborne exposure routes. Obviously, a comprehensive respiratory protection program that's fit for purpose is very important. Smoking is a significant source of lead, not just from contamination through hands to mouth, but also in the actual tobacco itself. Some tobaccos back in the day had quite a lot of high levels of lead as well. So having designated smoking areas where you're keeping people clean and away from the lead contamination really helps. Another big thing is something simple as banning compressed air or dry sweeping to clean work areas that are potentially contaminated with lead dust. In high-risk industries, you need to even consider having change houses where people are actually are not taking home contaminated clothing. So what they're doing is they go to work in their normal civilian clothes, they get changed in a clean area, move to a dirty area, put on their overalls, their work clothes, PPE, and then go into the workplace. And then when they finish, they come back, they'll take off their dirty PPE, that gets laundered on site, and then you have a shower before you go back into that clean area, put your civilian clothes on and go home. Similar protocols need to be sort of taken in place when people have their lunch break. So in crib rooms, you need to provide hand face wash facilities, even boot cleaners, disposable booties to put over to stop tramping lead contamination, tramping into your lunchroom areas. And in the picture, you can see there also that there's actually foot pedals. So people, when they wash their dirty hands, aren't contaminating the taps. And then continuing that, so by having the pedals, you're removing that possible pathway of exposure. Obviously, personal health and hygiene also has a huge impact on exposure to lead. And simple things like starting your shift with food in your stomach will actually reduce how much lead you'll be absorbed if you ingest it. Also diet, avoiding fatty foods. If you've got fatty foods, that's actually going to help lead being ingested into the stomach and into the body. Obviously clean hands, if you bite your nails, smoking, as I mentioned before, and also learning to minimize touching your face. And that's something that it's been raised also now in this pandemic of people wearing face masks, is with the face masks, they're actually touching their face more often. So if they've touched a contaminated surface, they're actually more likely to actually have to get it into their mouth and become infected. So that's a really important thing and a hard habit to change, actually. Controls you can put in to minimize community exposure. Obviously, effective site waste management programs, processes and programs where you wash mobile plant and equipment before leaving, allowing to leave site, actually banning domestic vehicles from these work sites. We had a problem where we had a group of children that were having unusually higher blood lead levels than most others. And what we traced it back was actually they were the children of contractors who were using their work vehicles on site and then ferrying their kids around to school and to sporting events. So they were getting their exposure in the back seat of the car. Maintenance carried out on site rather than being carried off site, or if it is has to be undertaken off site, all the plant and material is actually cleaned prior to leaving site, and having security checks at the front gate to making sure that vehicles are washed and cleaned, and these protocols are followed is really important. Okay, take-home lead. So particularly those that are working in industries where they get contaminated. Once again, I've already spoken to you before about having a change house where you have a dirty and a clean area, you have a shower before you leave work, you're not actually taking your contaminated clothing home and laundering it at home. That way you're contaminating, your laundry and potential exposure to your partner and your kids as well. Obviously don't take work equipment home. That's a thing that a lot of large organisations do. People borrow equipment to do household chores, renovating and landscaping and things like that. That's a way of taking that potential lead exposure home. And obviously not driving, vehicles on sites. So, when, you know, we're talking about really itty-gritty things and really small exposure pathways and sources, but it really does make a difference. I mean, if you take a simple calculation, you know, the average human has 5 litres of blood. If an individual has a blood lead level of 20 micrograms per decilitre, which I believe is the current permissible level, that's 1,000 micrograms of lead in the blood. So that's 3 grain cubes of brown sugar. That's all it is. So yes, you know, these things may seem petty, but actually, when you take away the significant source of exposure, such as inhalation, these things become very important, particularly as we lower blood lead thresholds and also try to minimise exposures to our children, which is really important to do. Okay, I wanted to just talk briefly around assessing workplace exposures. So there's lots of different methods that you can assess exposure to lead, and depending on the method you use, you're using it for different reasons. So there's various qualitative and semi-qualitative methods you could use. There's visual methods where you're sort of identifying sources of contamination and exposure pathway routes, both for inhalation and ingestion. You can do things such as wipe sampling, once again to highlight contamination of surfaces and areas, and also air monitoring as well. And that could be for lead, or it could be just for general dust in general, to be able to just assess how effective some of your control strategies are. And then you have obviously your quantitative assessment strategies, where you're obviously doing air monitoring for lead specifically to assess the potential for inhalation exposure. And then also, very importantly, if you have assessed an activity or workplace exposure risk to be significant, then you need to be putting in a biological monitoring program where you actually assess how much blood is actually getting in the body, to actually assess how effective the various control strategies you've implemented have been. So just to give you some examples, semi-quantitative, just a dust track. You're not specifically looking at lead, but if you know that the lead is a certain proportion, you've characterised that dust, then that's a good way still of being able to get an idea of how effective some of your controls are. I used to use a dust track to sort of get a feel for, you know, the levels of contamination when you'd open doors, entrances into crib rooms or into the change houses, certain activities where the change house manager was throwing dirty overalls into a laundering bin. So it was really good in that way. Visual assessment was really crucial, particularly in getting workers and contractors on board to understand how they could be exposed to lead, and and how important some of these pathways were. So the good old D-lead contamination test kits were great, where you could basically, you'd spray part A on a gauze or a cloth, then you'd wipe it over what it is, whether it was someone's hand, fingers, their isolation lock. Quite often they used to play with them, or their keys in their pockets, or even their pens, which they put in their mouth. And then you put the second part on, and it would come up bright yellow, and that would really shock the workers because you saw that visual association with lead exposure, and that certainly helped them identify their own unique exposure pathways, which they could focus on. Once again, biological monitoring program, really critical to use to assess how effective your control program is in assessing the effectiveness of your control strategies that you've implemented. Another little nuance that you need to be very careful of here is how you take those blood samples, and the importance of distinguishing between taking venous samples via injection out of a vein and a pinprick, where you'd have a machine pinprick on the finger, and the blood would get on there, and you'd pipette a bit of blood out, and you'd test that way. And what I found very early on in the piece was that pinpricks weren't a good indicator of actually the lead levels in the blood because of contamination on the fingers. And a small little study I did where we actually found that the skin contamination actually overestimated the exposure if you were using pinpricks. And what we found was the average difference between the actual venous blood lead level and what we got from a fingerprint was, differed by an average of 12 micrograms per deciliter, which is very significant when you're talking about a target level of around 20. So what we did there, that actually helped us help our hygiene practices, because a lot of these big burly contractors are very tough, are very scared of needles. So we could offer them that if they kept their blood levels below a certain level, they could have a fingerprint test. And that actually helped them drive the proper hygiene behaviours that we needed to minimise the exposures through ingestion. Just want to quickly mention, obviously, the role of an occupational hygienist in this space. Obviously, it's very important. We have a significant role in providing guidance and support. Obviously, we can help with hazard risk assessments, identify those specific exposure pathways, which are significant, undertake exposure monitoring. We can identify appropriate risk-based controls. We can help in training and awareness for stakeholders involved in the program. Obviously, we can help to develop a respiratory protection program, and then obviously develop overriding lead exposure management plans, procedures and swims wherever they're necessary. So we have a great role to play in the management of lead exposure. So that's my presentation. Thank you. I've got a picture of a statue of Beethoven here. Don't know if you know the significance or association with lead, but if you do, look it up if you haven't. And now we'll just open it up to some questions if there's been any on the chat.
I think you might have done an extremely good job there, Andrew, because not many questions have come through. Jason has been writing a couple of questions himself, so you can thank him a bit later on. Some of those questions that he's raised is, what methodology or guidance limits should be used when assessing the need for remediation of lead, say for lead dust or lead paint?
For remediation, well, I suppose it would depend on what you want to remediate to. Is it going to be still an industrial area? Is it going to be a new housing estate, where you're going to have potentially a lot of young kids? So that's going to impact on what level of remediation you're going to do. So I think you have to understand what you're trying to achieve in the first place to determine what's appropriate. So that's a big issue. It's not something I could probably talk about now, but it depends on what you're trying to achieve with the remediation. Is it from an occupational exposure setting? Is it a community exposure setting? Or is it an environmental setting? So depending on where you're coming from will determine what levels you'd want to be remediating to.
Another question through was, what is your position on using the lead soil guideline levels when testing for lead content in ceiling dust? So something that could be an occupational issue for residents that live in that area or people that work.
I'm not familiar with the soil guidelines, but I'm assuming what they're saying is, what's up in the ceiling sitting there is not too different to what would be in soil. Look, I'm not too sure there. I'd be characterising what's in that ceiling, trying to understand the levels and the form of lead that's in there. That was an interesting thing in Port Pirie when we used to help the community, because there was a lot of people renovating very old houses that had been 100 years old, been there since the smelter first started, and the ceilings used to actually bow. It was so heavy from the lead in there, and we used to provide them with HEPA filter vacuum cleaners to clean it out, and then we would just put it back into the blast furnace and recycle the lead. It was quite a good source of lead. But yeah, sorry, I can't respond in more detail to that question.
And last one here would be, should lead dust clearance limits be that have been utilised from the AS 4361, despite being superseded, should we continue with those clearance limits? Or is a risk assessment based approach the preferred?
I've always taken a risk-based approach, because if you take a risk-based approach, you'll always comply with the regulations. And then that's where we can fall into a trap when we're just trying to comply with regulations. Whatever we do becomes a tick and flick, and we actually forget why we're doing things. So for me, it's always risk-based. It's characterising the risk and determining how you can mitigate that risk with the effective control strategy. So personally, I don't focus too much on those kind of documents or regulations in that sense, because if you take a risk-based approach, you'll manage the risk and you'll always comply with the regulations. Hope that's answered the question a little bit.
Perfect. And that's all the questions for you. Thank you very much.
Thanks again. Thank you very much for listening. I hope it was useful.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That was very much appreciated. I'm amazed that our blood lead levels were 30 micrograms per deciliter when we had leaded petrol in our cars. And I really do like the fact that you need to have a full stomach before you do any work beforehand and minimize fatty food. So all you guys out there eating chips and burgers, make sure that you fill your stomach with some healthy food before you go out and do any work. I'd now like to introduce Abe Lau to come and speak to us today. Abe Lau is a principal inspector from the Hygiene and Toxicology team of Safe Work New South Wales. Abe's formal training as a chemical engineer has provided a solid base for a diverse career with experience as an engineering analyst and technical writer in sectors such as mining, processing, defence and process safety, but also includes experience with explosives and on-film sets. You'll have to tell us a little bit about that, Abe. That sounds pretty exciting. In his current role, Abe's skills as presenter and educator are often used to engage with the wide variety of people of different cultures, knowledge and experience to mentor, educate and inform. Currently, Abe's main focus of work is on lead and respirable crystalline silica. Abe has been kind enough to speak to us as the regulator on work health and safety legislation, current changes in lead regulations, risk controls and common issues. So I'd like to welcome Abe.
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. Thank you, John. Thank you for the AHCA for the opportunity to speak to your members. This is a topic that we get a lot of questions about, lead work, and I know that there's a lot of questions out there. So if you have anything on there, please send them through on the chat line. Thank you to Andrew for the introduction. A lot of the stuff that Andrew talked about, I'm going to back up, and that's a good foundation for some of the legislation that I'm going to cover today. So today, that's me. Yeah, John gave me a nice intro. Thank you, John. Very good. I've been with SafeWork for about 10 years now. So I've worked with the manufacturing team previously and also with the major hazards team. So I'm in a hygiene and tox now. In our small group, we have a lot of very knowledgeable people about chemistry. We've got industrial chemists, formulation chemists, a couple of COHs, occupational hygienists. I'm a chemical engineer, toxicologist. So if you have any questions, we might be able to help you if you need something in terms of guidance. So today, we'll talk a bit about, basic awareness of lead, Andrew's covered, the health effects Andrew has covered. The exciting stuff, the stuff that you've been handing out for is the legislation discussion, because that's interesting. Government has a way of making simple things complicated, so I'll try and walk you through that. The section in the legislation about lead is not necessarily difficult, but it can be tricky. So I'll try and walk you through it. Recent changes in legislation. There was a change about 1 year ago, about 12 months exactly, 12 months yesterday. And it's in, another milestone for that change is 12 months time in the future when those changes become active law. And I'll talk about that in a second. I'll talk about risk controls, which the legislation talks about, and some guidance around that, and some common issues. I've got a fair bit to go through. I'll try and get through it. I'll talk quick. If I make mistakes, forgive me. We'll get started. Okay, so the first slide up. As of yesterday, 1st of July 2020, some new laws came into place, and this is a bit of a segue. It's not actually about lead, this is about silica. I understand that some of this is of interest to the people viewing today, so while I'll mention it, I won't dwell on it too much unless there are some specific questions. Today is about lead. But the laws that started yesterday includes that the workplace exposure limit for silica has halved from halved to 0.05 milligrams per cubic meter for a 8-hour working day. There are now on-the-spot fines for uncontrolled dry cutting of manufactured stone that safe work inspectors can issue. And that's, keeping in mind, that's manufactured stone. Silicosis is now a notifiable condition. So if you go to a doctor and they decide through tests that you have silicosis, it's their responsibility to let the appropriate government agency know. And there are penalties for businesses who fail to fail to notify Safe Work of any adverse health monitoring results. So an adverse health monitoring result could be, in terms of lead, compulsory removal from work, or it could be adverse health advice. So it could be that a worker does not have the compulsory removal from work blood level, but a doctor has said, that's high enough for you. You need to be removed from lead risk work at the workplace for some time to come until your blood levels come down. That's an adverse health, that requires an adverse health notification. Okay, so going away from silica, we'll get back onto lead. As Andrew said, lead has been known to humanity for a long time. We understand it. We, as a society, we understand how it affects us. We can control lead exposure. It is preventable. Taking that knowledge, the legislation, which is the Work Health and Safety Regulation 2017, has built that into legislation. There are 2 hazardous chemicals that are specifically mentioned in the legislation, have their own little sections. One's asbestos and one is lead. So it's recognized that those 2 particular chemicals have special risks. And I'll talk to you guys about the lead section in just a minute. So why do we have to do this stuff? Because it is the law. It is the law if you're running a business. It's the Work Health and Safety legislation. It's the Work Health and Safety Act and the Work Health and Safety Reg. Riveting reading, if you really want to have a go at it. I wouldn't do it if you're driving. Okay, so let's go to the first definition in the beginning of that chapter is about lead process. This is a very, we get a lot of questions about this. It is probably written in a way that's a little bit more difficult than it needs to be. In general, lead process is any work process that you can access or be exposed to in a line of work that can expose you to lead in general. So if you're doing anything for work and you can get exposed to lead, that's a lead process. I'll go into that second point in a second to give information about health risks of lead work. Lead process is any process that can expose a worker to work. A subset of that is lead risk work. There's a definition that is there where the blood lead levels, BLL, blood lead levels, go above 20 micrograms per deciliter. That's just a unit of measurement like liters are for milk. It's just a measurement. Sorry, it's a bit warm here, I'm sweating. It is a subset. So lead process, you have to work out if you're doing a lead process, whether that is lead risk work or not. How do we do that? We'll go through it. How do you know your work is lead risk work? Well, you've got to assess your lead process. The legislation gives us guidance in clause 402. And like some of the guidance provided in legislation, it's a bit hard to follow. So it does talk about using past experience. So if you have done lead work before, in your experience, doing that process, what has happened? It also talks about physical data. If you have taken monitoring results, you can use that as part of your assessment. And then part of your assessment could also be working out your likely dose that the worker might be exposed to. So what are they doing? What's the form of lead that it creates? What processes will be using? What frequency are you doing those jobs, and what duration will that worker be doing that job for? that all works out to, you can calculate a dosage amount of what a worker might be exposed to. So on the, it's an educated guess as to whether your worker will be doing a high risk lead work or not. Importantly, in the assessment process, the legislation clearly says you can't consider the protective effects of PPE. So if your workers are doing that job and they're not wearing PPE, will they get exposed to a high enough level that their blood levels go above an arbitrary number? That number, how it's chosen is, I'm not sure, but it is written, and a year ago, that limit was lowered, and I'll go into that in a few slides' time. So what happens to you if you decide that you are doing lead risk work? If you are doing lead risk work, the PCBU, as in the company that's doing that work, needs to fulfill their legal duties. The legal duties include, you must notify Safe Work New South Wales within 7 days. The notification form to notify us is on our website. There's no license. You don't have to apply for it. There's no fee attached. We don't give approvals. It's not an approval process. It's different to the asbestos process. It's merely a notification process to us. After you notify us, we will send an acknowledgement letter and you'll get a unique reference number. I know that some of the tier 1 contractors out there are aware of our lead process. They would like to get their subcontractors to notify us. So they ask to see that unique reference number to know that they have notified us. So be aware of that, guys. That's the process there. If you are doing lead risk work, the PCBU has a duty to provide health monitoring as well. So a lot of the things in this section about lead are actually written in the main section of the legislation. It's just that they're so important that they pick them up again in this lead section and specifically drum it in. Health monitoring is one of those sections. Health monitoring is unique for lead in that the legislation guides us in saying we need to do health monitoring before the work starts and again 1 month afterwards for the first time you do that lead risk work. The PCBU must pay for the costs of health monitoring and provide that health monitoring report to the worker, to the regulator in the right circumstances, and other PCBUs as appropriate. When does the PCBU have to give the health monitoring report to us as the regulator? Well, these are the 3 conditions. When the BLL exceeds the mandatory removal from work limit, that's 1. Number 2 is when the worker may have contracted disease, injury, or illness from the lead risk work, or if that worker receives any medical advice for remedial measures to be taken, so removal from the work itself, as we talked about before. Okay, so for health monitoring, if your worker has been health monitored and their blood lead level comes back and it goes above a certain threshold, then they have to be removed from work. There is a compulsory removal from work limit. There's also a compulsory return to work limit. So after you exceed this certain threshold, you must reduce the blood threshold to a lower limit before that worker can be returned back to lead risk work. And records also have to be kept for 30 years, whichever way you choose to do that. One possible method is to go through a health provider for a business, and they have the means to keep records for long periods of time. So that could be one of your solutions out there. As I mentioned before, the laws for blood lead levels changed about 1 year ago, 1st of July 2019. And to follow the rest of the world, the allowable blood exposure limits in general dropped. As Andrew was saying, World Health Organization has stated publicly that there is no safe level of lead, but I guess in terms of it is real life, lead is around us. So there are tolerable limits that are put into place. The changes are subject to a 2-year transition period. What that means is 1st of July last year, the law changed. So the exposure limits all dropped, but there's a 2-year transition period in which we will not do any enforcement of those new laws. And so from the 1st of July 2021, that's when the new limits effectively become law. They are in law at the moment, but we won't be enforcing them. So you still have 12 months to get used to the new legislated exposure limits. And if you think that your results to come back for your workers, you're not hitting those new marks, then you need to have a look at your processes, revise your risk assessments, and maybe get some third parties in to have a look if you can't work out what's going on. This next section, I'm going to walk you through some of the changes. There's going to be a lot of numbers. I don't want to scare you. I'll just point out the important bits. So, as I mentioned before, there is a definition of what is lead risk work in the legislation, and it says that if you get a blood level of, at the moment, it's 30 micrograms. If you get a blood level, if you think that your workers are going to be exposed above 30 micrograms, then it's lead risk work. In the new world, 1st of July next year, it'll be 20. If you think your workers are going to get exposed above 20, then that's lead risk work. Andrew mentioned that children are more susceptible for lead exposure because there are many different reasons. And because children are so vulnerable, the mothers looking after those children are also vulnerable. And that is reflected in the legislation. So there are exposure limits for men. And in that category of men, and also women not of reproductive capacity. And then if you are a lady, a woman of reproductive capacity, then there are lower exposure limits that you're allowed to be exposed to. Actually quite tight. It's probably the best that, unless the situation or the processes are very well controlled, it's probably easier or preferable that not many female workers do lead risk work. If you have good controls and can demonstrate that, then no problem. You'll see on the page there that the limits have dropped significantly. I won't go through those particular ones. This is the one I mentioned before about the removal of workers compulsorily by law. It was 50 for males, now it's dropped to 30 to be applied 1st of July next year. So that's quite a considerable drop. If you guys did lead risk work already, check your numbers just to see how good or bad your controls are. This is the number for the return of workers. So after your guys get removed compulsorily, this is what you have to drop your workers to below in order to accept them back into lead risk work. So those numbers are all there. There is a document that I will share with John and the AHCA that I can, John can email around to you. It's a summary of the changes. It compares the old limits to the new limits. So that can email out to you guys. Okay, so that's the numbers part. That's hard to really identify with sometimes. Let's talk about the controls, and I'll build on what Andrew has talked about before. In legislation and general safety, we talk about the hierarchy of control, elimination at the top, PPE down the bottom. Same practical knowledge applies in terms of lead risk. Okay, so part of the controlling risks is to notify people who are going to be at risk to let them know that they're going to be exposed. So there is a duty to give information about your process to a worker. So if you're engaging somebody, say you have a shooting range and you're engaging somebody to come and do some cleaning, they might be sucking out all the lead projectiles at the business end of the range. Make sure that your subcontractors are aware of what they're doing. There is lead present and they need to take the appropriate precautions. There's a duty by law that one PCBU, one business, converses with another business to exchange information about risks. Type of training. So the duty to give information also means training your workers. And that also includes stuff about the stuff Andrew was talking about. What happens to you? what happens to your body, the toxic effects to your body. And that sort of gives a bit of weight to the need for health monitoring. It gives you that sell job to the workers that you do need to get health monitoring done to protect their health. There is a section in the legislation about risk control for lead as well. And the information in this section is actually good, sound advice. And I'll walk through this stuff with you at the moment because this is probably reasonably important, is very important. So basically legislation says if you have an area, if this room is a warehouse and say this little desk area is the area where there is a lead work being done, try to confine the contamination to a discrete area. You don't want the whole room being a high lead risk. Confine the area to a small area that you can control. Keep that lead process area clean. So you might have specific procedures for that one area. It might be different cleaning methods. It might be different regularities. It could be something altogether different processes. In that lead risk area, ensure that no eating, no drinking, no smoking, or even chewing gum occurs in that area. Because as we know from Andrew, that ingestion is one pathway for lead to enter our bodies. So no food, no ingestion there. And to provide changing and washing facilities. So as Andrew talked about, I suspect that a lot of the viewers out there today are asbestos removers. You'll know about your decontamination units you might have in your yard or that you might hire. It might be a trailer, it might be a door on one side, you walk in dirty, you get your change, have a shower, come out clean on the other side. You don't have to hire that stuff, you can create your own. If you have a building where the corner is the lead risk works, just say you're removing the lead paint, make that corner locked off, it's your lead risk area. And when the workers walk out of that area to have their breaks, smoko, lunch, go home, make sure that they pass through the decontamination area. That's one way to do this. It's not the only way. So they don't have a choice but to leave through a certain pathway. On that pathway could be a washing station, could be mats sticky mats to take all the lead contaminated dust off your shoes, whatever it is. So take the decision-making process away from workers, give them a system that they can't avoid, and that makes sure that everybody follows the right things to do. That's one pathway, one possible solution. If you are looking for ideas on a solution for your workplace, you can either have a chat to us, we can give you some quick advice, or engage the services of a third party like an hygienist or a consultant like that. Oops, beg your pardon. Sorry, playing with your minds this late in the day. Controls. Okay, so the pathways for lead to enter your body, there are 3 possible pathways, as Andrew mentioned. There's ingestion, which is through your stomach, inhalation through your lungs, or skin absorption through your skin, obviously. Skin absorption is probably not as commonplace as ingestion or inhalation in the general workplace that we deal with. So I'll leave that out for the minute. We'll just talk about the other 2 routes of exposure. If you're breathing in anything that can harm you, then there are simple things that you could try and do. For it to be breathed in means it's got to be suspended in the air. So first thing you should try and do is to stop it from getting into the air. How do you stop things from getting into the air? Change of processes is one example. Wet processes, things like peel away type processes instead of using power tools for removing lead paint. That's one great way to reduce the risk. Wet sanding, if you have dry processes, you can possibly do them wet as well, dry sanding for instance. If you must do dry processes, and there are some examples where you must do dry processes, for example, maybe if you are removing the paint from railway station steelworks, the support structures of train stations and bridges, lots of steel members, lots of nooks and crannies, really difficult to do by hand. So you might have to do an abrasive blast. In that case, if you must use a dry process, make sure your dry processes are very well controlled. So encapsulation is sound. You've got control measures in place that might be tested. So maybe your pressure differential gauges inside and outside the bubble. Make sure the PPE you issue to your workers is properly worn. Supervision is an important factor in workplace safety. Fit testing is important. Fit testing is a term that probably wasn't well known more than 2 years ago, but it's going to be part of everyone's mind from this point onwards, after the bushfires, after COVID and everything else. Asbestos removers will know about fit testing. It's been part of your code of practice for a long time. So fit testing is very important. If you're going to supply workers with respiratory protection, it's not just giving them a mask. It is teaching them how to use it. It's training them how to maintain it, how to store it, know how to fit it properly to themselves, know when to change the filters. It's a holistic package. If you are to minimize breathing in dust, if the dust has settled, do not agitate the dust to put it back up into the air for the workers to breathe. So if you have clouds of dust around the table, around the workplace, no dry processes to remove it. That's just silly. You're just putting it back up in the air. So don't use compressed air to blow it down. Don't dry sweep. If you can, vacuum is a great way, or wet sweeping is also another great way. Vacuum trucks and all that type of thing, street sweepers, that type of thing in factories. Avoid dry processes. They're the risks of exposure. Oh, sorry, that was one root of exposure. My thummy fingers are making the pages go really quickly. The other route of exposure is ingestion. How do you prevent somebody from ingesting lead? Well, it's kind of basic. Listen to your mum. Wash your hands. Thoroughly decontaminate before you have any meals. So any exposed skin, hands, forearms, face, is probably a good idea to wash all those things. If you just wash your hands, that's smoko, you're probably doing a bit of this, touching yourself, whatever, you're scratching. Wash exposed skin if you can, always a good idea. Things like nail brushes, very simple, $2 at the $2 shop. It reminds people to get the crud out of their nails, into the cracks of their hands, very simple thing. It's important you do this before every break. When you're having your break, it's when you smoke, it's when you have a coffee, it's when you have your sandwich. Wash your hands carefully. And importantly, in the work areas themselves, don't contaminate the food you're about to eat. So don't take your food into the work area. So, okay, so Andrew mentioned taking lead risk home to your family. This is a thing that has happened in the past with other substances like asbestos, where the families of workers have suffered from the effects of exposure. Lead is one of those things you can take home to your family as well. So leave it at work if you can. In the legislation, it does say that the PCBU, the company, can provide laundering services. And that's a good idea to avoid bringing lead home to your family washing machine. Leave dirty clothes at the workplace. Lead smelters, I'm sure other foundries, that type of thing, where there's ongoing lead work, will probably have laundry facilities at the workplace. If you're doing removal work, you're probably going to have a different workplace each time. So one thing to consider is disposable overalls. The rubbish goes onto the surface, you just turf it out at the break or at the end of the day. Don't have to worry about it anymore. Don't have to worry about laundry, etc. Don't forget that if you decide to change before you get into the house, and when you get into your car, you're transferring dust from your clothes into your car as well. And next time your family gets into it, they could be exposed. So please just get rid of the dirt before you get into your car to go home. Okay, I've said a lot. That's a lot of the stuff around the legislation and some basic risk controls right there. Risk controls don't have to be difficult. When you think about how they enter your body, through your stomach or through your lungs, think of it that way, then it can be quite easy to think about risk controls. I'll talk a little bit about an issue that was brought up in the last question to Andrew. And this is about, sorry, I'll go back one here. The Australian Standard 4361. We've had a few questions about this in the past. As I mentioned before, I'll preface this, I'll introduce the standard. It is the standard for the guide to lead paint management. And it was revised in 2017. The old version, 1998 version, had clearance levels for different surfaces for lead clearances. In the 2017 version, those clearance limits were removed. what the strain standard says now is to refer back to the appropriate regulator or refer back to the contracted agreement. So in terms of that, Safe Work is not the appropriate regulator for that. I'm not sure who is, but we are more concerned with workplace safety. The level, as I mentioned before, this desk could be made of lead, but we know enough about it that I can control the exposure to lead such that I could potentially even eat off this table without being exposed to any lead. So the amount of lead available on a surface does not necessarily reflect how much lead is absorbed by a worker. So that's one reason why we're not necessarily concerned with exposures and clearance levels. Going back to that though, advice that we have given on the phone before is that in lieu of any clearance levels publicised by strain sources, you could go back to the superseded version and use that as a reference in lieu of anything else. I don't believe there's anything else out there. It might come back down to a contractual obligation in the contract for the work you're doing. Okay. Another question we get is mandatory air monitoring. Do we need to air monitor around lead work? This is a tricky one. Air monitoring is good if you don't know what the risks are. In terms of lead, if you're doing lead risk work, you're required to do a blood test. You need to do biological testing. A blood test is the gold standard for working out how much lead is in your body. All the lead that comes into your body via your lungs or your stomach or through your skin, it doesn't really matter the route of exposure, it comes out in your blood. So if you have a high blood level, that means your processes are not up to scratch. That is, so if you have a high blood level for one of your workers, that could be a reason for you to get some air monitoring for a further job. If you're getting blood monitoring results are quite low, that can demonstrate to us that you don't have a significant risk there. I hope that answers some questions out there about that. So I think that's pretty much what I was intending to cover. Are there any questions that people are willing to ask or wanting to ask?
So there is a couple of questions that relate to that, which is, will Safe Work be releasing surface dust clearance limits, given that they are absent from the AS 4361?
No,
and if not, can you please let the audience know who is and when they may be issuing such guidance? Or without such guidance, are the regulators relying upon an educated client to enforce good practice?
Good question. Well, as Andrew said, it's horses for courses too. What is the risk? What are you trying to do? There's no point in cleaning a ceiling space to the exposure limit if there's nobody that's ever going to go up there. So what are you trying to achieve? If you're going to, if you have lead dust on an eating surface in a hospital, that's a different risk to having a lead dust in a ceiling space. In terms of the exposure limits, I understand that one of the reasons why they removed the limits is that the world trend is for lead exposures to go down. Australian standards, once upon a time, used to be quite well resourced, so they would meet, they would review, they would revise the standards on a regular basis. That's changed, so I believe that one of the reasons why they took out the exposure standards is to make the current version of the standard a longer lasting version. It becomes more of a risk-based standard rather than a prescribed standard. In terms of the right regulator, it's not Safe Work. We don't really, it's not our jurisdiction to worry about how much lead is present in the environment or in the workplace. Our concern is making sure that the workers don't get exposed to it.
So I think the next question's along the same lines, which is from Bruce Napier from Ausgrid, which is Safe Work prepared to provide guidance on the surface level exposure limits for lead in dust, specifically for indoor environments where the dust may not be soil derived?
Yeah, I think I answered that before. I'm sorry, but that's not something that is likely to happen. I don't think it's our jurisdiction either.
No problem. I think that's it in relation to those parts.
Okay, well, thank you for your attention on time. I imagine that you're if you've got any questions, please forward them through to John through the association. Happy to try and answer everything. You can get my contact details through John as well if you have specific questions. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it. Cheers.
Don't run away yet. I've got a couple of questions for you.
Thanks, John.
With the, I guess the lead process, in the standard or the regulation, it talks about lead paint and machining or buffing lead paint at a level above 1%.
Okay.
However, with the new Australian standard that we've got out, that level has now gone down to 0.1%.
Yep.
What is the regulator's stance on, I guess, lead risk work around lead paint that is below 1%, but is now classed as lead paint as per the new Australian standard?
Okay.
Standard.
Thank you for asking that, John. That's a question that we get a bit too. If you have to put a hierarchy on references, the law always comes first. The legislation always comes first, then Australian standards, then maybe codes of practice. So in terms of weightiness, I'm sorry, I don't know how it's going to...
So I guess we're looking at the law which supersedes
Yeah.
the standard. So I guess the issues we've got is that a lot of our consultants will go out and test paint. Previously, we would say that that paint was non-lead based because it was below that 1% threshold. Now we're classing that as lead based. And obviously, you know, if the paint needs to be removed, are we then classing that as lead risk to be on the safe side? Or do we then say, well, it's not lead risk because it doesn't comply with the regulation?
Australian standard, thanks for reminding me. Australian standard talks about the lower percentage for defining lead paint. That's not written into our legislation. Our legislation writes 1% as an automatic pass-go type of gate for lead paint. And it comes down to risk as well. Recently there was a case where telco workers were doing some joining work of cables. While it doesn't strictly fall under the definitions of lead process that were, there's a list of maybe 10 or 15 tasks which are defined as lead process. This one falls out of that, but the worker was exposed high enough that he had to have some remedial medical attention. So regardless of that, it's lead risk work. We're trying to protect workers from lead risk. So whether the percentage is 1%, that's an automatic definition, or if it's less than that, if it's 0.99%, does that mean a worker's less at risk? I think it's not about the percentage, it's about what you're trying to do to protect your guys. If you know that the paint's 0.5%, but you're smashing it up with power grinders and the guys aren't wearing PPE, they will get exposed, they will get high blood levels. It doesn't matter what the percentage is.
Yeah. All right, fantastic. Just another question around, I guess, exposure standards. So we've got national exposure standards for lead, 0.05 micrograms per meter cubed, milligrams per meter cubed, sorry. Now, how does that relate to blood lead levels? Is there, if we can show that our people are being exposed to levels below the exposure standard, will that then demonstrate that their blood lead levels would be significantly low?
I am aware that there are some papers out there in the world that talk about to try and make a correlation between the atmospheric lead available and creating a link between that and a blood lead level. I think there are a lot of different factors that affect the blood lead level that Andrew mentioned, and it talks about your own physiology, your own age, your own health, your diet. There's a lot of different factors which affect that. So I don't think that's easy to make that link. And at the end of the day, if you're doing lead risk work, you should be getting a blood test done, and that is the gold standard. That's what will go off.
All right, fantastic. And any more questions? I've got a question here from Lee.
A couple of last minute questions just came in, so I'll just add those as well. Some of these are pretty specific to remediation of lead paint or lead dust when they're doing demo work. Okay. And around that is who should be engaged to do removal of the lead paint or lead dust. Industry standard, what occupational hygienists and asbestos and hazardous materials consultants tend to do is utilise asbestos consultants to do those works, normally because they are already prepped up with how to decontaminate and how to use the PPE and so forth. But there is no requirement, to my knowledge, that you have to use that contractor.
Correct.
So how does Safe Work stand on that?
Because there's no licensing framework around lead, there's no licenses lead worker as in a similar way to there being a licensed asbestos remover. There's no licensing, there's no prerequisite for who does that type of work. It's just that you have the right controls in place to prevent exposure. You're right. If somebody notifies us they're doing some lead risk work and they're an asbestos remover, I automatically have a bit of a sense of confidence that they know what they're doing because of the asbestos work is, the requirements are up here. And lead's pretty much the same level really. So if you don't do that work, you don't have any experience on, and you notify us, in the notification process, you notify us, we then, if we don't know who you are, we'll probably call you and talk about your job and what controls that you're going to apply in that job. If you come across, if I come across a notification, it makes me think you haven't done this work before, I am going to call you and I'm going to ask you a lot of questions about what you know. If it's going to be a big job, I'm going to want to hear, I want to hear a bit more certainty about, you know, what you're doing. I might even make a recommendation to engage a third party to do the work because quite frankly, that's going to be easier for everybody involved.
Absolutely. I think you just answered the other two parts of that question as well, which was, should they be licensed similar to asbestos? At the moment, there is no license for it. And the other part of that question was training and certificate. Do they need to do that? And I think you just answered that as part of what you said there as well.
Training, there's no formal training course that I'm aware of at the moment out there. I know that some painting associations do offer a lead awareness course. Different hygienists may offer lead training courses as well. There's no set curriculum that I'm aware of. But lead, as we talked about today, it's not it's well known, it's well understood. A lot of information is out there in the world. So if you're confident in building a package, you could do that yourself or engage somebody who knows better, like a consultant or a hygienist.
Perfect. And that is all the questions. Thank you.
Thank you guys for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Abe. Really appreciate your time there. Just one last question for you before you disappear. I guess as the regulator, you're privy to a lot of the information around blood lead levels. You must be reviewing a lot of notifications in your time and reviewing the blood lead levels at the same time. In terms of contractors that are undertaking lead paint removal or lead dust removal, what is the, I guess, what's the risk associated with you know, exposure to lead, and has that reflected in blood lead levels which have been quite high?
Okay. We don't get a lot of people who get notified to us who have been compulsorily removed from workplaces because their blood levels have gone above that limit, but there have been some, and it's probably been two recently. One was involved with, I think it was like the joining of cables. In old cables, you've got lead sheeting around old cables, probably submarine cables especially. And when you're cutting through it, you're releasing lead dust. If you're not aware that lead dust is going to be released, you're probably not wearing the right protection and you're going to be exposed. So that's good. You've got to be aware of that. And different pathways, different sources. I'm sorry if I didn't answer all your questions.
No, it's all right. I guess, you know, with the guys that are removing paint, and be that blasting or peel away, have we had incidents of high lead levels?
We have,
guys?
sorry, yes, I beg your pardon. There was also another case I'm aware of a lead paint remover using high pressure type of gurney.
Okay.
And like asbestos, it's high pressure, it blows dust everywhere. And it's not just the water pressure, the water sucks the air behind it as well. So you get the water and air blowing stuff everywhere. High pressure cleaning is not meant for any hazardous chemicals. I think it's the safest way to avoid that, be it solid or liquid.
And do we think with the new standards coming in, or coming into force in a year's time, will we be finding a lot more people with high lead levels?
I believe so. I think some of the reasons why we've been getting some notifications recently is some of the businesses have adopted the new laws and have changed their internal standards, internal procedures, such that if they exceed the current law as written, then they need to do something internally. and they'd be notifying us as part of their own procedures, which is great. It's good to see. It's good to see that people are getting to come to terms with the new limits and working out what works well for them to manage that new limit. So I encourage people to have a look through your blood test results when you get your workers' results back, and just to see if you need some help to drive those BLLs further down.
Fantastic. I think that's all the questions I've got. So thank you very much.
Thank you,
Abe.
John. Cheers.
Appreciate your time, and thank you, Andrew, for all your time. Thank you, everyone, for listening online. I hope you found that informative. What we will be doing is we have recorded this session. We will go through and edit it, and then hopefully make that available for everyone to look at. Should you have any questions in the short term, please address them to admin@ahca.org.au, and I'm happy to pass it on to Andrew and Abe as well. Thank you again, guys. Again, if you do, and we encourage you to become members with the AHCA, you can see we're looking at the major issues that are facing our industry at the moment, and obviously trying to work through them. I would also encourage you to be part of the working group that we will be forming shortly around lead paint and lead dust. Obviously, this we've spoken about exposure today and health effects. We're hoping to have a number of additional sessions in this series. And if anyone feels that they would like anything spoken about or discussed, please feel free to bring it up with us. Thank you all very much for attending. Thank you, Abe and Andrew again. And best of luck. And we hope our next session will be with us all together in a social setting where we can have a few beers and a bit of a nibble and a chin wag and understand what we've all been doing of late. So thank you again, and good night.